This edition of the iServe HCM and Payroll Cloudcast talks about the importance of localization in SAP SuccessFactors. My name is AJ Whalen. I'm with iServe, and I'll be your host for this presentation. And we're going to talk a bit about localization compared to globalization, which are two terms that you may hear, and sometimes they're incorrectly used interchangeably. And we'll talk a little bit about how SAP SuccessFactors handles localization services. So today, HR, which traditionally has been known as the group that handles the talent management portion and identifies and retains the staff, really has a key role in compliance in an organization. That's important to understand. HR has to comply with really what is an evolving set of regulations across every country. Those are constantly changing. So they have to understand what's going on, what changes are happening, what changes are going to be happening in the near future, because the risk for non-compliance is very steep for organizations. There are fines and other penalties that can really damage an organization. So HR has to remain very vigilant and at the forefront of the regulatory compliance. This is an interesting statistic that came from the SAP legal change reports this year. And it's in the last 4 years, the dramatic increase in the number of laws and changes that affect HR in the countries that SAP tracks, 22% increase in the number of labor laws and changes. That's a huge increase. And if you're an organization and you're dealing with that type of amount of changes across each year, you need to be very aware of what's happening. And that's where localization services like SAP provides in its SAP SuccessFactors solutions becomes very important for HR. So again, we just gave an example of the number of labor law changes, but if you look at this, we'll step back maybe a little bit from a macro level and talk about what's happening today that's causing a lot of changes in regulation. Globally, obviously financial instability, we went through a recession several years back that caused a lot of regulatory changes. There have been scandals around banking and finance that have as well, geopolitical issues and things that are happening in different regions of the world. And of course, a lot of privacy legislation. So HR is not immune to all of the regulatory changes that are happening because there are constantly adjustments and changes that are related to those more macro issues that can affect wage and hour regulations, specific reporting requirements, and especially around anti-discrimination and union reporting requirements, and a lot of integration and interface requirements as well. So HR needs to be aware of what is happening at all times. Non-compliance is not something to be taken lightly because as these regulations change, the penalties increase as well. So there have been a number of cases in recent years where companies have been caught in non-compliance situations and have had very steep fines, in some cases into the tens of millions of dollars. So it's certainly something that HR needs to be very aware of because the risk of non-compliance is huge. So localization, obviously, of regulations and best practices, along with the maintenance of the changes in the systems, are required to keep HR compliant. That's kind of an obvious statement, but it's what we're going to talk about here for this presentation. So we're going to start with this quote here, which comes from Luke Marson in an article that was published in searchsap.com. And what he's talking about here is that localization in terms of HRIS is really not just about the ability to comply and to submit a report, but its ability for the system to support those standards and regulatory changes that affects country-specific fields, functionality, validations, code, workflow, logic, and of course the reports and all the taxation changes that you need to make in your system in order to remain 100% compliant. So localization is a very critical term here, and this is a great quote for explaining that. So now what we're going to do is say, okay, we talked a little bit about localization, and if you do reading on the topic, or a lot of HCM software vendors talk about globalization or localization, and they're often used interchangeably, as I said earlier, and that's really not correct. So let's start with globalization. And globalization really is about the ability of that software to work in a specific region or country. So what does that mean? It means it supports the time zones, the currencies, the language translations, and some of the configurable fields that you may have check digit schemes and other formats that have to be followed, like addresses and phone numbers and postal codes. That is globalization, not the same thing as localization. And as that quote we just talked about from Luke Marson, localization is really allowing the changes that are happening to be maintained and met in the software itself. So there are changes and requirements into the system that allow HR to meet those requirements, to meet the reporting requirements, and to make sure that those changes are made directly in that code, in that system. Big difference between just being able to operate in a country and support a language or a format versus actually uh, proactively changing based on regulations and supporting the actual business processes. So again, globalization, being global, doesn't mean just supporting some elements of that process. And what SAP SuccessFactors does really well, which is a great differentiator for Employee Central and for their entire suite, is allow companies that operate in the countries they support to have both global and local compliance, and also, we'll talk a bit about this, but proactive monitoring of legal changes in those regions. So localization is a service. It is also part of the software and really important to HR to remain compliant. Let's just talk about some examples of localization in different regions of the world and how SAP SuccessFactors addresses them. So obviously, localization creates some requirements in a system, and they can look at it from different perspectives. So you might need country-specific fields to support things, and we've got some examples here, the tariff code in Germany, for example, or the date of first entry in France, or things that are very specific to a regulatory requirement in a country or a region. Obviously, SAP SuccessFactors will monitor the regulations and make sure those codes are available, those fields and those codes are available. So there are many rules that go behind the fields as well that may be validation checks, for example, around social insurance or social security numbers, address validations, and banking code check codes that may go in there as well. Reporting is a big, obviously very visible component of this because that's typically what HR organizations will have to produce in order to remain compliant. So actually making those reports available to customers and delivering them with the releases, including things like the first day notification in the Netherlands, EEO1 reporting in the US, and of course in Ireland, the Fair Employment Report. Integrations for local government agencies and authorities like or benefits vendors and stock vendors, those are also very important as well. And there's a lot of times regulation will drive changes in those formats. So it's important that those are maintained and monitored as well. And of course, taxation is constantly changing, as any of us who've worked in payroll understand. So changes to pay, taxation, and of course, pension rules can also apply there. So let's look at a few specific examples of changes of regulatory requirements across different regions. So in Germany, there is a requirement for a declaration of challenged employees, and it's a reporting that companies have to submit to the German Federal Employment Agency to certify their treatment of challenged employees. And there are fields and there are reports in SAP SuccessFactors that help them address this issue. Staying in Germany, of course, the German data entry regulations require some pre-configured business rules that perform validation checks. You must remain compliant with the reporting requirements to send specific data in a specific format for German employees to the government. And this is provided by SAP SuccessFactors and even takes into account that you may need to customize the rules for German employees that may be working in other countries. In Russia, here's an example of a localization issue that is really not related to a reporting requirement per se, but actually about data privacy. So in Russia, employee personal data of Russian employees must be stored on servers within Russia. So how is that handled? Well, it's certainly an issue that remains that needs to be met by SAP SuccessFactors. So what SAP does is they've got a data center that's located in Russia, and they have real-time internal synchronization that allows that data to be stored in Russia, even if the customer's instance is located in a different country. So data is then written to the global data center afterwards, and it allows them to remain compliant with that law. The data is staying within the borders of Russia, regardless of where it's done. So there are things that are from a compliance and a localization issue that are much deeper than just reporting. So for the UK, Of course, there is the EU Working Time Directive that says that employees can't work more than 48 hours in a working week, but employees have the ability to opt out of that. So what SAP SuccessFactors has done from a localization perspective is put a country-specific field in there in the job information that allows you to track whether the employee has opted out of this particular law, and also fields for tracking the number of hours they're working in the specified time periods to make sure that they're not in violation. So these are types of reports and data fields that allow the HR organizations to remain compliant. In the US, EEO-1, Equal Employment Opportunity laws, so employers that have more than 100 employees or some federal contractors maybe below 100 employees are required to submit reports to the government that show how their hiring and employment practices affect race, ethnicity, gender, and some other categories. There is an EEO-1 report that is managed and provided by SAP SuccessFactors to allow companies that do business in the US that fall under this to report properly. Now, in Switzerland, there is an employment statistics report they refer to as the BESTA report that requires employers to report employment stats on their workforce to the Swiss Federal Office of Statistics on a quarterly basis. So SAP SuccessFactors provides the report to employers in the system that allow them to prepare the BESTA form, and it's got a lot of information about the employees and nationality and all of the things that are required by the Swiss government. And finally, in Brazil, employees obviously are protected from discrimination, and there are laws around that, including a report required to submit to the government that protects against unfair dismissal, again, making sure they're not unfairly terminated. So the employers must submit this report on a regular basis, and SAP SuccessFactors delivers the report that allows them to do that. These are just a few examples of some of the reports and some of the processes. And again, as we saw with that example with Russia, they're not all just about reports. So that's, there may be 1,000 of those a year or thousands of them a year. So why is localization different at SAP SuccessFactors? Well, it starts with a couple of things. The first is awareness. And this is really important because if you're an HR organization, you may not have the resources to remain on top of all of the things that are changing globally or changing in all of the regions in which you have employees. SAP has a couple of hundred resources that are dedicated to monitoring and tracking regulatory changes across 81 countries. And these resources are available for customers to help them stay on top, to understand and plan for those changes. So it's very important to be proactive with this, and the awareness feature of the SAP SuccessFactors localization services does that. So on the other half, you can be proactive, but what happens when the changes are coming in? So the reaction part of this equation is the actual changes to the software itself. And this is important because it differentiates between vendors. Some vendors don't provide the reaction part of this. They may just provide the awareness part. They may tell you changes are coming, but what SAP SuccessFactors does is make sure that changes in the code, the source code to the system, are updated, so that can include new fields, new changes in workflow, new reports, changes in the UI, the user experience, changes in the database to support new fields. SAP handles all of that and delivers that in the releases for their customers. Also, the SAP Upgrade Center is really a great place where customers can monitor and maintain, because that's where they're going to provide the announcements and the activation of changes that are coming up. So it's updates, it's timelines, it's notices, it's a lot of information for HR to stay on top of, but it really keeps the communication lines open between the teams that are working on the awareness and the actual delivery of those changes through the reaction process. We've just spent the last few minutes talking about how SAP SuccessFactors handles its localization services and how that helps HR organizations of their customers remain compliant with regulations and changes. iServe has a service called Cloud Care, and that's how they help their customers monitor, understand, and implement changes across the board from releases that are coming up. So Cloud Care really simplifies support and release management. It was created by iServe to help customers meet the process, the data, and legislative requirements that they face throughout the year. So first and foremost, it allows them to get things fixed. So as things throughout the year that may have issues that may be caused by configuration challenges or other things, we work with customers to get that resolved so that their system is working properly. Again, getting it right means getting the changes done in a specific time frame and getting their technical things documented as well. Keeping things up to date is release management, very important for customers who may be coming from an on-premise environment and aren't used to the release schedules and the pace of change that may be coming down the road. So it's making sure they're aware of how to do it. And of course, getting it done is really just the ongoing user and processing support, allowing their users to understand how these changes will affect them and how they affect the business processes. That's our quick iServe Cloudcast for today on localization. I hope this is helpful and hope you'll join us for another video again in the future.